Thanks, Jono. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. About 3:30 on a Friday afternoon, a gathering of around 250 people assembled for a secret meeting in a private art museum. The meeting is scheduled to start at 4 p.m, ensuring it concludes before the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. The mood in the room is tense and expectant. There's a statement to be read at the meeting, which has only just been finalised but an hour before the scheduled 4 p.m. start time. And a man charged with carrying the statement to the meeting has forgotten to arrange his transport. And he realises at the last moment, and he stops a passing, as it turns out, unlicensed motorist and requests a ride. The driver refuses. The man begs for his help, explaining the importance of the paper that he holds in his hand. The driver relents and accepts the responsibility and even drives at top speed to get the man to the meeting on time. The speed attracts the notice of a passing policeman, and again the car is waved over. The man hurriedly explains the importance of the cargo, and then the policeman waves them on. They arrive at the museum. The time is 3:59. At 4 p.m, a short man with a bald head and a shock of white hair at its perimeter bangs his gavel on the table. But rather than falling to silence, the audience erupt in spontaneous song and sing together the Hatikvah, a word meaning hope. And the short man rises to his feet and reads the prepared statement. It takes just 16 minutes. A prayer is offered, the document is signed by many signatures, and the Hatikvah is sung again. The short man, David Ben-Gurion, then concludes the meeting with the words, "The state of Israel is established. This meeting is adjourned." Outside the building, there are thousands of people gathered. The secret had got out. And this massive group of people are singing and dancing in elation. So the State of Israel officially began at midnight, so on the 15th of May, 1948, Israel came into being. Just 2 days before the declaration of the State of Israel, the Minhalet Ha'am, meaning People's Administration, had convened to vote on the Declaration of Independence. Of the 13 men which formed the committee, 3 were absent. 2 were besieged in Jerusalem, and 1 was in the US. The remaining 10 had to decide between accepting an American proposal of peace between the Jews and Arabs within Palestine, or declaring independence for the Jewish state. The vote was carried, 6 in favour, 4 against. So whilst today the State of Israel is a fact, in early May 1948, nothing was sure, nothing was clear. Not even the Jews of the Minhalet Ha'am knew whether they're going to have a state in a few days' time. But Bible students did. Maybe not the precise day or month or even year, but Bible students knew that the State of Israel would be formed again on the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. And the proceedings of the declaration of the State of Israel, which took but 30 minutes in its entirety, was thousands of years in the making. The prophets of Israel have made it clear that God would regather his people. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 11 says that God shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. The prophet Jeremiah says, I, Yahweh, will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord. I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And the prophet Zephaniah adds his voice. At that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth, when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. And so, long ago, thousands of years ago, the prophets of Israel foretold that their people, whilst they would be dispersed, would again be regathered. So, how came it that Israel was dispersed in the first place? Well, we have to go back in time just for context. This picture is a picture of the Arch of Titus, which you can see today in Rome. It depicts the Jewish captives along with the spoils, including the Jewish menorah, the seven-branch lampstand there, being taken from the temple in Jerusalem. It was taken by the Romans in the year AD 70. In actual fact, there's several Jewish captivities, the main ones being by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Romans. And so through these three major captivities, the Jews have been dispersed far and wide. If we look at the third of these, this was prophesied as far back in the scriptures as Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Bible. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 49 that the Lord shall bring a nation against Israel from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. So this nation, whoever it is from the end of the earth. Prior to the Roman captivity, the two invading forces that took significant number of captives were the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who were both from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was relatively close to the land of Israel. Rome, however, was the other end of the then known world. They're described as coming as swift as the eagle flieth. When the Roman army went to battle, the first cohort always claimed the post of honour and the custody of the eagle. And so they marched under the standard of the eagle. You can see a picture there, a little hard to see perhaps, of the Roman eagle etched into the Arch of Constantine. The third defining feature of this invading army is they have a tongue thou shalt not understand. And the major invasions prior to the Romans were by powers that had Semitic languages, which shared some common attributes with Hebrew. However, Latin spoken by the Romans was totally foreign to the Jews. So we identify that the Romans here are prophesied many years ago, before they came upon the land of Israel, as an invading force who would take Israel captive. The Romans laid a siege around Jerusalem, and the conditions in that siege were horrific. And again, they're described for us by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, "Thou shalt eat the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters." Imagine eating your children. Josephus, the historian who lived at the time of the Roman siege, records how this happened. He writes in his book, Wars of the Jews, "It was now become impossible for her in any way to find more food. She then attempted a very unnatural thing, and snatched up her son who was a child sucking at her breast. She slew her son, and then roasted him, and ate the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed." Horrific time in the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans. So the Romans destroyed the city, but they also destroyed the temple. Now this too was a matter of prophecy. The Lord Jesus Christ, living just a few years before the Roman invasion, about 40 or so years, he said these words. This is what Jesus said. As Jesus left the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." They're looking at the temple. It's a magnificent building, a formidable building. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So Jesus prophesies this temple, the temple of God in Jerusalem, is going to be thrown down, not one stone left upon another. Now, the Romans, when they came under the general Titus to overthrow the city and the temple, he respected the magnificence of this building, and he commanded his soldiers to preserve the temple. Do not destroy the temple. And when it caught alight, he commanded them to put the fire out. But as the fire took hold, it melted the gold, and the gold went down in the cracks and so forth. And of course, the soldiers wasted no time in their pursuit of the gold, and so the temple was destroyed. And the stones you can see there are at the bottom of the foundation wall that surrounds the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So this too fulfilled Bible prophecy. The Jews were then taken as slaves by the Romans and sold. Moses foretold this as well in Deuteronomy 28. "There ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." And because there was so many captives taken by the Romans, the price of slaves plummeted. And you could hardly get anything for a slave. There were so many on the market. Josephus records how 97,000 were taken as slaves by the Romans and sold, every one of them at a very low price, and that because such as many as were sold were very many, and the buyers very few. And so as slaves, they went into various nations, and by were scattered among all nations. Again, as prophesied in Deuteronomy 28, "The Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other." And then throughout history, the Jew began to wander, and the term wandering Jew is well known to all. "Among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest," wrote Moses in Deuteronomy. We can see there how the Jews went from one country to another. No sooner had they found another abode and they were expelled from that country, and so they had to find another place to live as they crisscrossed Europe looking for a place of safety. So Martin Gilbert, in his book The Atlas of Jewish History, set about to write a general history of the Jewish people, but he had to divert his focus because of what he found in his research. And he writes this in his preface: "My original concern was to avoid undue emphasis upon the many horrific aspects of Jewish history. I wished to portray with equal force the construction, achievements and normalities of Jewish life through almost 4,000 years. But as my research into Jewish history progressed, I was surprised, depressed, and to some extent overwhelmed by the perpetual and irrational violence which pursued the Jews in every century and to almost every corner of the globe. If therefore persecution, expulsion, torture, humiliation and mass murder haunt these pages, it is because they also haunt the Jewish story." That's the history of the Jewish people. It's not a recent phenomenon of last century that saw the Jews persecuted beyond belief. It's been their story as a nation throughout time. Again, this is prophesied. "Thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, Would God it were even, and at even thou wilt say, Would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see." The Jews were hunted out. And this persecution eventually brought about a desire to return to the land. And so Jeremiah 16, verse 16 says, "Behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks." We have there probably the most prominent of all the hunters of the Jews, Adolf Hitler, a madman. And three Jewish children on their way to Palestine, having been released from the Birkenwald concentration camp. The girl on the left is from Poland, the boy in the centre, Latvia, and the girl on the right from Hungary. So Jews from all over the world had been gathered together by the Nazis in order to destroy them, but some survived and found themselves on their way to the land of Israel. But before the return, from the scattering until the return, the land would lie waste. This too was foretold in Leviticus 26. "I will bring the land into desolation, and you will I scatter among the nations, and I will draw out the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be waste. Then shall the land enjoy its Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate, and ye are in your enemy's land, even then shall the land rest and enjoy its Sabbaths." Ezekiel 38 talks about the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste. See, from the time that Israel was taken captive until their return, none of the nations that occupied the land thought to cultivate the fertile soil and enjoy the rich benefits that were to be had. So Israel were punished. They were brought low, but they were not destroyed. So we read in Jeremiah 30, "I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished." So Israel were punished. They were dispersed into all nations of the earth. They were persecuted in their dispersion. They were chased from one country to another. It was a horrific existence. But God kept his promise, as he always does, and did not annihilate the Jewish race. He would punish them in measure, correct them in measure, but not leave them altogether unpunished, but he would bring them back to the land. And so we come to the regathering. What was it that really sparked the desire in the Jews for a regathering? Well, there's many things, many persecutions, but there was one particular incident which grabbed world attention. Back in 1895, the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish artillery captain in the French army. And a French spy who was searching for a treasonist who had passed military secrets to the Germans discovered that the handwriting of Alfred Dreyfus was similar to that used in the treason. Dreyfus was arrested, court-martialed, found guilty of treason and sentenced to prison on Devil's Island, a very remote island in horrible conditions. Before he was dispatched to Devil's Island, he was paraded before a crowd who shouted, "Death to Judas! Death to the Jews!" And his insignia was ripped from his uniform. His sword was broken in two. This particular event triggered widespread anti-Semitism through the French community, and few would dare to suggest that Dreyfus could be anything but guilty. Dreyfus was depicted as a serpent and a pig in the cartoons that appeared in the press. Some time passed and the head of the French army intelligence was changed and a new person was put in the position, a man called Georges Picquart. And Georges Picquart embarked on an investigation into the whole Dreyfus affair, and with much research he discovered that there was actually a different French military officer, a man by the name of Major Ferdinand Waslin Esterhazy, who was actually the real traitor. He mentioned this to his superiors and was told in no uncertain terms to cease from all further investigations, and when he didn't, he was then transferred to Northern Africa and later imprisoned. You can see the force of anti-Semitism that had gripped the French nation at this time. Another man, Émile Zola, a very well-known author, wrote an open letter defending Dreyfus and exposing the military cover-up. He was convicted of libel. And so it was that eventually the word of Esterhazy's treason got out and he was court-martialed, but quickly found not guilty. And so it was that the Jews at this time realised that they would never be safe from anti-Semitism until they had a land of their own. And so just 2 years later, the first Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, was conducted by Theodor Herzl, known as the father of Zionism. He wrote, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it." And so Zionism had begun. And there was a growing feeling of fervency amongst the Jews to found a land of their own. In 1909, there was a group of people travelled to the land of Israel, and there they are standing on the windswept sands of Tel Aviv. There's nothing there. Today it's Israel's most populous city. But there they are, a few hundred people gathered together to commence the founding of Tel Aviv. A few years went past. The most notable event occurred, which resulted in one of the most important documents ever written in the last century. There's two men primarily behind it. A Jew called Chaim Weizmann, later became the president of Israel. Another man of British Parliament, Arthur Balfour. Chaim Weizmann was a lecturer in chemistry at Manchester University. He was one of the greatest advocates of Zionism. And there in Britain, he influenced many of the British establishment to support the Zionist cause. Arthur Balfour, a member of the British government, at one stage he was the Prime Minister, but at the time of interest here in 1917, he was the Foreign Secretary. The two first met in 1906, 3 years after the Zionist leadership had turned down a proposal for a homeland in Uganda. And Balfour couldn't understand why the persecuted Russian Jews would refuse the offer of a safe asylum in Uganda. And he says to Weizmann, "Why are the Jews opposed to the Uganda plan?" Weizmann says, "Suppose I were to offer you Paris instead of London." Balfour replied, "But Dr. Weizmann, we have London." "That is true," says Weizmann, "but we had Jerusalem when London was a swamp." "Are there many Jews who think like you?" said Balfour. "I believe I speak the minds of millions of Jews," replied Weizmann. "It's curious," Balfour remarked, "the Jews I meet are quite different. "Mr. Balfour," says Weizmann, "you are meeting the wrong kind of Jew." You see, there's quite a bit of debate amongst the Jews themselves as to whether they should go back to Zion, to Palestine as it was then known, or establish a homeland in some other place. By 1917, Weizmann had convinced Balfour and many of the other parliamentarians of the cause of the Jewish people. And so the Balfour Declaration came into being. And this one-page document with just a short paragraph in the middle there were these very important words: "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." It was a landmark document. It's interesting, though, that when this document was written, Britain did not have control of Palestine. It was not theirs to give. But all that was about to change. In World War I, the Allies had initially tried to invade Turkey directly on their own soil, and they failed abysmally, as we all know all too well in our own national history at Gallipoli. The only successful thing was their exodus from Gallipoli, where not a soul was killed. Other than that, the whole campaign was a disaster. A similar outcome was found when the Allies tried to take on Turkey in other parts. But when they came in, attacked Turkey from the perimeter of their empire and pushed up from Egypt, things were different. They had success. And on the 31st of October 1917, the Battle of Beersheba took place, the famous charge of the Australian Light Horse Brigade, where the Turks were totally overcome, with the horsemen charging straight over the trenches, the guns pointing at the wrong angle, the guns of the Turks that is, and in no time at all, the Anzacs had overcome the Turks and took Beersheba. Just 6 weeks later, the British General Allenby famously walked into Jerusalem on foot to show respect to the Holy City. The Turks retreated and Jerusalem was taken without a shot being fired. And so Britain now had control of the Holy Land. Shortly after World War I, the League of Nations made a mandate for Britain to administer the territory of Palestine until such a time as the inhabitants were able to stand alone. The Balfour Declaration's national homeland for the Jewish people was to be established alongside the Palestinian Arabs. So now that the Brits had got themselves into a spot of bother, they'd made too many promises about the same plot of land. They'd promised it to the Jews, they'd promised it to the Arabs, and now it was payday. They both wanted that land. And so the mandate, which was in force from 29th of September 1923 to the 15th of April 1948, was a period of protests, of riots and revolts by both Jewish and Arab communities under the British rule. During this period, there was three bodies of Jewish resistance that were formed. There was the Haganah, which was the main paramilitary organisation, which later transformed into the Israeli Defence Forces. There's the Irgun, which engaged in more daring activities, including the bombing of the King David Hotel. And a third one, the Stern Gang. There was lots of bloodshed as the Jews fought to get the British to come good with a promise on the Balfour Declaration. In all the turmoil, the British were seeking for answers, how to solve this problem of their duplicity in promising to the Arabs, promising to the Jews. Because the Arabs were in the majority, they came out with this idea, which was published in the British White Paper. Jewish immigration will be limited to 75,000 people over 5 years. Jewish immigration beyond that will be determined by the Arab majority. That's going to work, isn't it? Furthermore, the Jews were restricted from purchasing land from the Arabs to just 5% of the land. This resulted in mass protests, and ships overloaded with immigrants fleeing Europe were turned away. One famous example is the Exodus, which got turned away with its decks full of Jews fleeing from Europe. Well, a short time later, World War II struck and things changed again. With World War II came Nazi domination and extreme anti-Semitism. There was ghettos, deportation, labour camps, death camps, and 6 million deaths of Jews. 1 million of them children. You can't get your head around that, can you? 6 million Jews died brutal deaths at the hands of the Nazis. And so as the effects of the Nazi war machine filtered out after World War II, the United Nations were persuaded to approve the Jewish state. They voted in 1947 to petition the land and give half of it, or thereabouts, to the Jews and the other half to the Arabs. And the Jews accepted this decision by the United Nations, and the Arabs flatly refused. The Brits were glad to be rid of the problem, having handed it over to the UN, and now they just had to get through to the time when the mandate would finish and they could wash their hands of it. The actual vote in the UN is interesting. It was actually deferred by 3 days. The vote needed 2/3 majority to pass. If the vote had taken place on time, that would have had the majority, but not a 2/3 majority. And so in that extra 3 days, there was a massive canvassing by the Zionists as they contacted every statesman they knew. And the result was that 3 days later, with the hard work of men like Chaim Weizmann, Abba Eban, David Ben-Gurion and many others lobbying the governments and diplomats, the vote was carried 33 in favour, 13 against, with 10 abstentions. The most notable abstention was Britain, who had given up in despair, as we said before, was glad to be rid of the Palestinian Jewish homeland problem. There was one vote which is noteworthy, and that is of Soviet Russia, who actually supported the creation of the State of Israel in a small window of time. And with their support came a number of other Soviet-dominated countries which also supported the vote. And so we come to where we started, Israel's declaration of independence on the 14th of May 1948, to come into effect at midnight, and the Jewish state would commence on the 15th of May 1948. And there in that art museum, now known as Independence Hall, David Ben-Gurion said these words: "The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained a statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom." And so it goes on. That was on Friday at 4 o'clock. The next day was the Sabbath. And throughout the world, the readings in the synagogue on the Sabbath are the same. They've been set down for a period of 2,000 plus years. The Torah schedule, in fact, was from the time of Ezra, and the Haftarah, or the prophets schedule, dates back to a little before the time of Christ. And the passages which were read on the 6th of Ayar 5708 in the Hebrew calendar, or the 15th of May 1948, were Leviticus 19 and 20 and Amos 9 verses 7 to 5. Let's turn to Leviticus. We're just going to read a few verses from Leviticus reading, which was read the 19th of May 1948, day one of Israel's existence. Let's read from Leviticus chapter 20, and we'll begin at verse 22. Ye shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them, that the land whither I bring you to dwell therein spew you not out. And ye shall not walk in the manner of the nations which I cast out before you, for they committed all these things, and therefore I abhorred them. But I have said unto you, ye shall inherit their land, and I will give it unto you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, which have separated you from other people. These were the words which were read in every synagogue on day one of Israel's existence. Isn't that amazing? It's worth reading the whole of those two chapters because it shows us and Israel that God gave them the land with conditions. Conditions that they obey him. Conditions that they obey his word of truth as found in the Bible. Let's come now to the Haftarah, that the prophet's reading in Amos chapter 9. In Amos 9 and beginning at verse 7. Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, saith the Lord? Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? What God is saying is, Israel, I decide who gets what land. Whether you get your land, what land the Philistines get, what land the Syrians get, I decide it all. I'm the one who gives it. You may think you got this land out of your might, your trickery, your prowess, but your land comes from me, says God to Israel. Verse 8. Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from off the face of the earth, saving that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, saith the Lord. So if a nation is sinful, I will destroy them, says God. One exception, Israel. I will not utterly destroy you. But the implication is clear. I will punish you if you sin. And punished they had been. They've just been dispersed for nearly 2,000 years. Now it's time to bring them back. Verse 9. For lo, I will command, and I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, like as corn is sifted in a sieve. Yet shall not the least grain fall upon the earth. Israel are scattered amongst the nations, but I'm going to sift them out, separate them out. Let's come down to verse 14 and 15. And I'll bring again the captivity of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and drink wine thereof. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them, and I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God. And again, Israel are being told that it is God who regathers them. Now, I'm not suggesting that these verses are fulfilled in their entirety, but these verses were laid out thousands of years before they were read on day one of Israel's new national state. And the implication is clear. Israel are in the land because God brought them there. And as that being the case, they have a responsibility to obey God's commands and to fulfill his wishes. Well, in 1948, Israel got their land. But the movement was called Zionism, and they hadn't got Zion or Jerusalem. We come to the prophet Joel. We find that he prophesies in chapter 3, verse 1, "For behold, the days come, and in that time, when I will bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem." Now, Judah is the southern part of the land of Israel. And you could say that the land of Israel was largely got by the Jewish people in 1948 as a result of the UN petition and the War of Independence, which increased their boundaries somewhat. But they didn't have Zion. I think it was Chaim Weizmann who said, you can't have Zionism without Zion. But they had to wait another 19 years. And then in 1967, in the famous Six-Day War, they also received the city of Jerusalem. And it's interesting that the prophet Joel separates those two things to bring again the captivity first of Judah and then of Jerusalem. So again, when we start to delve into the detail of Israel in their modern history, we find that it all fulfills Bible prophecy. The next verse of Joel is actually also interesting and a warning to the Gentile nations. God says, "I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them or judge them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land." Now, it wasn't only in the UN partition that they parted God's land. That's certainly a very prominent example of where the Gentiles have parted the land of Israel and given part to the Jews and part to the Arabs. This is the biblical view of a two-state solution. It doesn't support it. This isn't a political comment, this is a biblical comment. God has given the land to Israel. My comments are not about how Israel is acting today and how they're waging their wars and how they are or aren't getting their way in the land of Israel. Because whatever they do, whether it's godly or not, we know that the hand of God is acting behind the scenes and bringing about his purpose. But he has an issue with the Gentile nations because they have parted the land which he gave to his people Israel. When we come to the prophet Ezekiel, we read about an invasion in chapter 38 into the land of Israel, which was going to happen in the latter days. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but we just want to take a couple of points about how Israel will be situated just prior to that invasion. In Ezekiel 38 and verse 8, we read, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them." So there's a number of phrases in this verse which talk about Israel being back in the land. I've highlighted a couple of them there. Gathered out of many people, brought forth out of the nations. So prior to this battle, Israel will be back in the land. So that's a big tick. That's fulfilled. Israel is back in the land as a nation today. The second thing which we've highlighted there is that they shall dwell safely, all of them. Now, is Israel dwelling safely today? Well, they're at war, aren't they? I'd say they're getting there. In fact, they're getting very close. But let's just step through it. When Israel first declared independence, on the 15th of May 1948, 5 Arab nations declared war and invaded them. Since then, they've had many wars which have threatened their existence. But when we look at Israel today, things are different. they formed their first peace pact with one of their neighbours in 1979 when they declared peace with Egypt. Or more to the point, Egypt declared peace with Israel. Egypt was sick of losing wars. Some time passed. 1994, Jordan also declared peace with Israel. Many more years passed into fairly recent times, and we find the Abraham Accord in 2020. And the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco and Sudan all declared peace with Israel. And this was greater than the peace which Egypt and Jordan declared. This was a warm peace. This is a peace which would encourage and foster trade. It wasn't just the cessation of war. This was neighbours who wanted to trade and get on together to succeed. It's no secret that Saudi Arabia wants to join, but not during the current war with Hamas. They've got to manage a very delicate balancing act with their own people, but it's clear they want to join the Abraham Accords. So is Israel dwelling safely? Well, not so much a peace pact, but certainly something which bolsters their security. In December last year, they wiped out the Syrian military, one of their neighbours which has always been a threat. In the current war, they've also significantly reduced the threat of Hamas, Hezbollah, and even Iran, very much weakened. So, I'd say they're not dwelling safely quite yet, but they're getting there. It's looking very much as we would expect just before the invasion as described in Ezekiel 38. What else do we find in Ezekiel 38 and 39? Well, we find references to the West Bank, which is a very topical, very political, very debated subject in the world. The words West Bank as a phrase don't occur in the Bible. It's described as the mountains of Israel. And if you look at the map there, you can see it's from a biased person because they've labelled the West Bank as Palestine. The state of Palestine does not exist. It is the West Bank occupied by Israel. In biblical terms, it's neither Palestine or the West Bank, but it is the mountains of Israel. And you can see there by that topographical map that that is indeed where the mountains of Israel mainly are, through the West Bank. And so in Ezekiel 38 verse 8, which we already read, the invading force is going to come against the mountains of Israel. In chapter 39 verse 2, I will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. And that is where they're going to meet their end in chapter 39 verse 4. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel. So this invading force is going to take on Israel in the mountains of Israel, and there they will come to their end because God will intervene. So what we take from this is that Israel will still occupy the West Bank, the mountains of Israel, at the time of the battle described in Ezekiel 38. Now, why is this so important? Well, the West Bank is very topical, very political. Even in Israel, it's very political. And there's a strong force today which would like to give away the West Bank in exchange for peace. It's been like that for many years. In fact, Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel, and he signed an agreement, the Oslo Agreement, back in 1993 with Yasser Arafat. And in that Oslo Agreement, it says that the powers and responsibilities relating to territory will be transferred gradually to the Palestinian jurisdiction. And so they plan to give over much of the West Bank, almost all of it, to Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians. 2 years later, Rabin was assassinated at a peace rally. Shortly after that photo was taken there with him giving a speech. And the Oslo Agreement ground to a halt. It wasn't for lack of support amongst the Jewish people. There was many which would willingly give it away, but their driving force, Rabin, was dead. Time would pass before another Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, was prepared to give away 2/3 of the West Bank. Just fork out those where the Israeli settlements were in the main and keep them, but 2/3 of the West Bank he was prepared to give away to the Palestinians. And the Times of Israel there have got an article which we've quoted where he planned to give away these 2/3 to the Palestinians. And just a month after the telephone call which was reported on there, he had a stroke and never regained consciousness and died some 7 years later or so. So I guess it's a warning for Israeli prime ministers not to give away the West Bank, the mountains of Israel, which have been declared as what God has given to his people, the Jews, from antiquity. Well, where does that leave us? Our title is Israel Present, God's Witness to the World. And that title is taken from the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 43. I'd like you to come to Isaiah 43. We'll talk about Isaiah 43 in just a minute. In 1946, there was a discovery by a Bedouin shepherd boy of some scrolls in a cave. He had no idea the value of these scrolls and just passed them on for a small amount of pocket money, you might say. In these scrolls was one particular scroll which was virtually complete in its entirety, and that is the scroll of Isaiah, which has become known as the Great Scroll of Isaiah, so far as the Dead Sea Scrolls are concerned. It was written about 200 BC. That's before the Jews were taken captive and dispersed as slaves. So before the captivity under the Romans in AD 70, about 250 or so years before then, a Jewish scribe had copied out the book or the scroll of Isaiah in its entirety. And in that scroll is words which tell of Israel's return to their land. This scribe had copied it out before they dispersed. That can be proven by the archaeologists who have dated this scroll. Now, the scroll was discovered in 1946 by an Arab Bedouin. He sold it to a friend or anyone who would buy it. And the first time it came under Jewish notice was when an archaeologist, Eliezer Sukenik, came across a few remnants of one of the scrolls in an Arab souvenir shop on the 29th of November 1947. The very date on which the UN had voted to petition Palestine and give the Jews their homeland. On the very date that the world decided to give Israel a homeland, God puts into Jewish hands the first remnants of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would tell the Jewish people that he had promised their return so many years before. And so we come to Isaiah 43. And you can look up Isaiah 43 on the Dead Sea Scrolls online if you take down that link which I've got there on the slide. You can go to Isaiah 43 and see a picture of this very scroll scribed over 2,000 years ago, before Israel was dispersed, telling us that they'll be brought back to their land. And you can see there in the Hebrew text, Isaiah 43, verse 1, "But now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob," a name for Israel, the nation of Israel, "O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, For I have redeemed thee, I have called thee by name, thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. Israel, you're going to go through horrific times. You're going to go through floodwaters, through fire, through persecution of all sorts. But be assured, I will be with thee. I'm going to preserve thee through all these trials. Verse 5, fear not, for I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring thy sons from far and thy daughters from the ends of the earth. So it talks about the regathering of the people of Israel. And then verse 10. Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. So what God is saying to Israel is, you are my witnesses. I'm going to bring you through all sorts of persecution, which any other nation would be annihilated by. But I'm going to preserve you and bring you through fire, through flood, through all sorts of persecution, and going to regather you and bring you back to your land, and you will be my witnesses, so that people who see you will know that before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. In other words, Israel is God's witness that God exists. If Israel exists, God exists. If you want to disprove God's existence, all you have to do is get rid of Israel, and it just won't be done. People have tried, Hitler's tried, others have tried. Down through millennia, they've tried to get rid of the Jew, but he won't be got rid of because of his maker, because the Jew is the witness for the existence of God. Even in our own time, in the last century or more, a little bit more than our own time, we just look at the incredible events which have transpired and think, how can a people be preserved through all that? And yet here they are. How can they be preserved when 5 Arab nations want to get them on day one of their existence, but they're still here? And so it goes on. Israel are God's witnesses. But the story doesn't end there. This people have got a marvellous future. And Israel's future is the centre of God's kingdom, which is a consideration for next week. Hope to see you there.